Good morning, everyone. I'm Reverend Dori, and this is our fourth session of the Bible study about the Torah that goes with the Genesis sermon series. So we are not having class next week. There's another special event going on between churches, and so we're going to have our last Bible study on Deuteronomy on the 28th of August. So please, not next week, but the following week, come back and we'll do the last book of the Torah. So today we're going to look at at Exodus and Numbers. Now Numbers is called Numbers because it has a big census, okay? And we all know this story, right? The Hebrews come with Joseph, and they're here in Egypt, and then they get enslaved, and under Moses they escape into the desert, and because there's all this non-belief, and God keeps giving them extra stuff, and then they try to go into the promised land, and there were 12 spies that go into the promised land, and 2 of them came back and says, "We can do it with God's help," Joshua and Caleb, and the other 10 said, "Oh my gosh, it's so full of giants and armed cities and no way." And so God says, this whole generation has got to pass away. This generation who remembers what it was like to be in Egypt have got to pass away before they can be a new nation. And that's what the book of Exodus and Numbers is about. Now today I thought I'd talk a little bit about how archaeology has really fused our biblical study in new ways, and how we've learned a whole lot about both Egypt and Israel, and how a lot of what archaeology shows brings into question the stories as it's written, okay? Particularly archaeology that has taken place since World War II. It's since World War II and the Holocaust that Christian scholars and Jewish scholars have been working together. They didn't for generations. And also how a lot of the scholarship now, that archaeology is being led by Jews instead of by Christians in Israel. So there's a whole new looking at all of the Bible stories and all the things that they're discovering through archaeology. And one of the things that they've also looked at is the Hebrew people's use of numbers, okay? I put up the question here, how did the Egyptians not notice 600,000 fighting men leaving their country? How did they not notice that? Because the Egyptians are huge recorders of everything. But there's no record of any people leaving Egypt in large numbers, of any slaves leaving Egypt. So what do we do with this story? Well, first of all, the numbers in the Old Testament and in the New Testament to a certain extent are as much about meaning as they are about the actual numbers. For example, 40. We hear 40 all the time, right? Well, 40 in Hebrew language is an idiom for long enough, for a long time, for long enough, okay? So 400 is 10 times for long enough, which is really for long enough. And so if Jesus is fasting in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, it's for as long as he needed, for long enough. And there's lots of other numbers like that, where you give people old age as a way of giving them strength and giving them honor. You increase the numbers. If there had been a fighting force of 600,000 people, they had wiped out the whole Middle East, because that would be the biggest fighting force that had ever been seen in that day and age. So the Assyrians, for example, their whole army that wiped out most of the Middle East was 100,000. So the numbers are meant to be read in a way that gives honor and strength and gives other meanings other than the way we read numbers. The other thing that we know is that there was no conquest of Israel. There's no walls fell down in Jericho. There's no huge fires. There's, we do know that Egypt, after the Hyksos were the group that came into Egypt and ruled Egypt about the time that Joseph was there. It was probably a Hyksos. The people from Thebes eventually kicked out the Hyksos. Hello. And they didn't stop there. They went all through here, and they're ruling this whole area all the way up. It's ruled by Egypt, after Egypt is united into one kingdom. So you have recorded these people called Aperu. The Aperu were bands of marauders, okay? They had lost their flocks, or they had lost their land, and they came and they would sweep in and steal everything they could find and then sweep out. Some people think that the word Aparu is related to Hebrew. Others say, nah, not so much. But the Aparus are recorded in the Egyptians because they found that the Aparus operated a lot in this area, and they were a huge nuisance to the Egyptian rulers. The other thing that we know is that there's no way a huge amount of people could have lived in this area in the Sinai. Traditionally, people, the Hebrews, according to tradition, went down this side of the Gulf of Suez, and then they crossed over into Midian on the Red Sea, and then they came back to Mount Sinai, which is down here, and then they went up this way and came back. You know, that's the tradition. The most archaeologists think that they went this way through the marshes over to the Negev. And if I get a chance, I'll talk to you about a place in the Negev. There's no way that this land, which is really, really dry, could, even with manna coming from heaven, supported a huge number of people. So how did this story become the foundational story of the Jews? Well, a lot of archaeologists say that this group, fairly small group, but very cohesive group, under the guidance of this very charismatic leader, and bringing with them a new understanding of God, a God who cares about the downtrodden and the slaves of all people, rather than a God who cares about the hierarchy, and a God who bested the Egyptians. Those people came out of the desert and into this area, and they hooked up with other people who were also disenfranchised. It also appears that a lot of the Canaanite village cities emptied out at some point, probably with like a peasant revolution, maybe connected with this charismatic leader who comes in and tells this story about how we can overthrow the Egyptians. And there is an influx of people living in the highlands, not in the valleys where the Canaanites lived. And so it seems that this is a rise of the peasant classes against the hierarchy of both Canaan and Egypt. Now, why, and remember, all of this is oral history. Why do you tell stories why do you repeat a story? These stories were repeated over and over and over. Why? Well, one of the things that you might want to repeat a story is because it's funny, or because it makes fun of somebody that you want to make fun of. Like, for example, crossing the Red Sea. Most people think that the people walked across the marshy area on top of the reeds, and then the Egyptians, with their chariots, heavy chariots and horses, drive into this marsh, and guess what? They get stuck and they drown. And aren't they stupid to have done that? Really? I mean, come on. And so you tell those kinds of stories over and over. But you also tell the story because it says God cared about us. Us, the little guys. God cared about us. And of course, the Jews in Passover, they talk about this every year. And it's not when our ancestors were slaves in Egypt, it's when we were slaves in Egypt. It's the way they tell the story every Passover, every year. God cared about us when we were slaves in Egypt. You also tell stories because it knits people together. Maybe it shows that these people and these people can come together as unity. And so you tell stories like that. You also set up new rules about how people can live together. And Moses was a master of that. Set up new rules. There's all kinds of laws in the Torah. But of course we have our 10 Commandments, which were radical at that day. It wasn't an eye for an eye, it was a life for an eye, okay? You wipe out the whole tribe if they kill one of your people. It was a much more vengeful kind of way of thinking in the Middle East at that time. And the laws of Moses restrict that kind of violence. And they also set up an understanding of how life should be lived. You shouldn't live coveting other people's stuff. You shouldn't live coveting their wife. You shouldn't live stealing from other people. These are all things that help us live together. And they reestablish this unity of God. Now, it's not monotheism as we know it, it's henotheism. Henotheism means there are many gods in the world, but we will only worship one. We only say that there is one God for us. And so they bring this new understanding of God, of people, and they take over the land, probably not by invasion, but by a combination of a revolution of the peasants. And it goes on for many, many years. It's not quick. So this is what archaeologists have to tell us today, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.